Alrighty, hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode.
Woo!
Hello everyone.
Hello, hello.
Hi.
How's everybody doing today? Good. I would like to introduce our special guest today, if I may. This is my dear
Yes.
friend Stephen Patrick.
Hey.
Hey, Stephen is a co-founder of a local spiritualist church, of which I am also a co-founder. He is a historian in spiritualism and about a million other things. So, we asked Stephen to come on with us today to talk about the spiritualism as a religion, as a philosophy, as a science. And it's something that he knows probably more about it than anyone else I have ever met. So, welcome, Stephen. Yay! We're glad you're here.
Thank you.
Welcome. We're so
Great.
happy to have you here, Stephen. Thank you for being here today.
Glad to
Yes.
be here.
Thank you. So I think we should jump right in because, as many people know, I am a spiritualist and I have been doing this for about 7 or 8 years now. And I am going to first say, Stephen, tell us a little bit about yourself. Like, how did you find yourself in this religion?
I will try and keep this brief because it's complicated.
Yes.
I guess the short story is that I kind of so my family is all from Rochester here in Rochester, New York, and so we kind of grew up spiritualist adjacent is sort of what I call it, where like my family is like a kind of immigrant Italian Catholicism, but it was sort of like peppered with things of spiritualism of that nature. So it's like, we very like kind of cultural Catholics, like go to church on holidays, pray to saints and stuff like that. But then also like regularly people in my family would like go to mediums, go to psychics, go visit Lilydale.
Mm.
So I kind of grew up with that in the background. I eventually still as a child I moved when I was probably about 11 years old to Southern California, where I was kind of exposed to more like kind of Mexican flavored like Catholicism, but also kind of things like Espiritismo and like Spiritism, so like Latin American style Spiritism, all with in the background that I kind of hadn't had this knowledge of all of this growing up. Then like fast forward as a younger adult, I moved back to Rochester and kind of came full circle with spiritualism. And so throughout all of this, I was like very aware of um and interested in kind of like mediumship development. So I have a very like uh diverse, complicated relationship with spiritualism. But that's kind of the gist of that. I've It's been part of my life in varying degrees forever, basically.
Awesome. I'd say
That's so cool.
eclectic. You could be eclectic with all of that.
That's a better word. It's early.
Awesome. No, I hear you. I hear you. We are taping early this morning. Um, so I guess since we're going to talk about spiritualism, the first thing we should do is kind of try to find a definition for it. So,
Mhm.
why don't you kind of lead us along?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's kind of like two popular definitions that I like to focus on. So there's one which is spiritualism in its like broadest sense, which is that like if you kind of summarize spiritualism as briefly as possible, it's the idea that the identity, the personal identity of an individual, so however you want to interpret that, their soul, their spirit, the personality can exist after death. That's like kind of the first point. And then the second point is that we're able to communicate with this surviving identity afterwards. That's spiritualism in its like most broadest sense. And then the definition that's given kind of among more organized spiritualist groups like spiritualist churches, spiritualist associations is actually kind of what you mentioned earlier, that it's spiritualism is a science, philosophy, and religion. The one other thing I do kind of want to mention too is just the concept of historically what kind of spiritualism is, because a lot of people tend to think spiritualism is sort of the same thing as spirituality, and like spirituality or the word spiritual could apply to anything. Like anyone could be spiritual. You could be spiritual in like Muslim, Hindu, Christian, pagan, anything. Any of those types of things can be spiritual. But spiritualism is a specific like historical movement that started in the late 1800s, actually here in upstate New York, and rapidly spread around the world. It was probably one of the first and earliest like religious spiritual movements that really like just spread around the globe incredibly fast. And so it manages to kind of be in three of those different kind of modes of existence. Like I said, it can be interpreted scientifically. So you have people that who are investigate spiritualism from a scientific perspective. So that would kind of be like paranormal investigation, and also kind of like the handful of scientists that exist that try and like study like near death experiences or the concept of experience of like reincarnation. The philosophical aspect, um, the philosophical aspect is interesting because in the United States in particular, it's a little bit more connected to the religious aspect, but in some other countries, it's kind of just by itself. And this is just sort of like taking the concept that there's like an existence of the soul and that it exists after death and we can communicate, sort of like building a whole philosophy of life on that. Like, you know, metaphysics, what is good and what is bad, God, things like that. And then the religious aspect falls more into um, like spiritualist churches and actually having kind of like more ritual practices as well. And it may not be like incredibly ritualistic. Some spiritualist churches are more veered toward like the philosophical, but some of them have like rituals and they like candles and do all that fun stuff that I know you and me both love together.
Yes.
um,
Yes.
but the other thing is that with all three of these things, they don't have to be just by themselves. They can kind of all be, you can kind of take pieces from different parts of them and experience them in different ways. So you can approach spiritualism scientifically, but you can also approach it religiously, or you could just stick with one or the other. And it's a very flexible tradition, and that's I think one of the best parts about it.
I agree. It's got a fluidity to it, whereas you can take whichever part of it really you want to focus on and focus on it, but they all three
Mm-hmm.
tie together so well. And you don't always see science and religion as co-creators of something. They tend to be viewed as things on separate ends of a spectrum. But I
Yeah,
think when we look at spiritualism, when we get um the physical aspects of the things that people bring through, like the ectoplasm or all that. I think it's interesting to bring up that when it first started, it was in our area. So we live in a spiritualism kind of founding place. I mean, it's a little bit outside of our town, but it's here. And we had a lot of famous people coming in to talk in our town about this. But I think that there was a connection also like with the people who were studying spiritualism. And Stephen, please help me get this out there right, because I know I'm going to get it wrong.
okay.
Well, not wrong, but I won't probably won't get all of it. They were also the movers and thinkers of more progressive
Oh
movements in
yeah,
society at that time, right?
yeah. um Spiritualism is like, so in the late 1800s there was kind of like these progressive movements, reform movements. The 1800s, some ways we can relate kind of to now because it was what some people call like interesting times,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
yeah. And so you had just a whole host of all of these things happening. You had like this, the Civil War. Like spiritualism literally started slightly before the Civil War started. And so you have just kind of the aftermath of everyone being angry at each other all the time and constantly fighting. But then you also had this backdrop of just this, all these movements of people actually wanting to make society better, like genuinely wanting to make it better. You had like especially here in Rochester, that it's crazy because you have all these historical movements. They're all happening at the same time. And so spiritualism was actually part of that kind of nebula of ideas going around. And so you had figures like here in Rochester, like you had Susan B. Anthony with the women's suffrage movement. You had Frederick Douglass with abolitionism, and then all of these things going on. Then with spiritualism, you had the Fox sisters, and then you had people who were involved with everything, such as Amy and Isaac Post, who were a Quaker couple that were literally involved in every possible reform movement you can imagine, but also one of the two leaders of the early spiritualist movement. And they were just all involved with everything and all at once. And so spiritualism has really always been tied to like these progressive um, social, political, cultural movements as well. Over the years, kind of like ebbed and flowed with how much it's been. I don't think it really like comparatively to how it was in like the 1800s and early 1900s, it's nowhere near that. But most spiritualists still really look to those figures as being like really really important, and still kind of try and model how they carry themselves after those people who kind of just dedicated their lives to helping other people.
Oh, and I agree. And we have, I mean, Susan B. Anthony is buried here. Frederick Douglass is buried here. The Posts are buried here. So this is all kind of our area was kind of a central focus for this part of the country and this part of where we are to really start bringing it. And I think that's what has always, that's what made it so interesting to me is that, wow, I'm in a place where a whole lot of this stuff was happening at the same time. I mean, we had the Underground Railroad going on. We had all the civil rights things. We had so much
Yeah.
going on up here and to see it now. You did mention the Fox sisters, so I was wondering if you could just give a brief thing about that, because there's probably people out there that
Yeah.
don't really I mean, we've heard so many conflicting stories about what happened there, and I
I
think if you could spread some light
yeah.
on what really happened.
I also have very strong opinions about it, but I'll try and
Mhm.
leave those out.
It's okay.
The main story, which if you don't know anything about spiritualism, you will know this story. Like, especially if you're from here in Rochester, this is sort of like the one piece of history that everyone sort of focuses on and never talks about anything else, um, which definitely doesn't annoy me at all. So basically, the Fox sisters were these two young women who lived in Palmyra, which is outside of Rochester. How, what, like 40 minutes? Like about
It's
that?
about a half an hour from my
Yeah,
place. Yeah.
half hour, 40 minutes away. It actually doesn't even exist anymore as like a like sorry, excuse me. They lived in the village of Hydesville, which is now in Palmyra. Hydesville does not actually exist anymore as a village, but Palmyra does. Random fact: Palmyra is also where Mormonism started.
Yep. Yep.
The Hill Cumorah that Joseph Smith found his golden plates and all that stuff is like 15 minutes from where the Fox sisters lived. Um, so the Fox sisters were these young sisters that were living in a little cabin in the village of Hydesville, and I guess kind of long story short, they felt that there was like a spirit in their cabin. And they developed kind of this little system of communicating with the spirit through like knocks. So they would knock once, knock twice for, yes and no, or like they would do the alphabet, like say A, one knock, B, two knocks. And they kind of found out some stuff about this person who was supposedly a traveling like salesman, like a peddler who was supposedly murdered in the house. And so when this all started, it was kind of just like a really popular local ghost story. Like it got a lot of attention, and some of it was quite negative because this is the late 1800s. So the word like having them being accused of witchcraft was kind of tossed around a little bit. And so their mother decided that it would be best if they were sent to Rochester to live with their oldest sister, Leah Fox. Um, Actually, who at the time I think was Leah Fish, but she was married like 3 or 4 times, so her name changed quite a few times.
Can I
um,
interrupt real quick? My understanding of the events at Hydesville were that they actually did exhume and find
did
somebody in the
this
basement
this
that
was this was
was
this was years after though.
okay, okay,
Like this was like several years after they did,
okay,
which they did
okay.
though. They found like you can if you go to Lilydale, there's a museum. They do not have the bones, but they have the trunk they found in the basement. So they actually, as what Deanna said, years later they would find bones, like a part of a skull or something. It was they were not preserved very well because the ground was so like the groundwater is really high there,
Mm-hmm.
and so it just was not very well preserved. But they found a trunk, like a salesman's trunk, and bones, and we don't really know what happened to the bones. anymore, but the trunk is still in the Lilydale Museum. Anyway, they were
Amazing.
sent to
Okay.
Rochester to live with their oldest sister. And that was kind of where, through a series of kind of events, the story shifted from being like this local ghost story to being like, oh, you can communicate with these spirits and they can communicate back. And so in November, I think it was 19, not 19, 1849, the Fox sisters with their oldest sister Leah and also the Quaker couple Amy and Isaac Post rented the Corinthian Hall here in Rochester, New York, which no longer exists, but it was like this gigantic lecture hall. And they basically demonstrated their mediumship gifts. And that was just kind of the first time that ever really happened, like publicly, ever, anywhere, where people had demonstrated phenomenon in terms of like mystical experiences and things like that. But in terms of like them being like, we can communicate, you can too, this had never really happened before. And so that shifted this like little local ghost story into being this just worldwide spiritual movement. And at that point, all these people started who had already been experiencing these things because these things weren't new. Other people began to like start experimenting with their own abilities and studying, and that's where it kind of started to develop into like this, like, the tradition that we were talking about, science, philosophy, and religion. So here in Rochester is really where all that happened. This is sort of like the jumping off point for like this huge worldwide movement. Like it truly like the numbers at the time were like, it went from just like a handful of people in like this kind of random city in upstate New York to being just everyone all around the world by like, I think the numbers are probably a bit skewed at the time, but I think they said by like the like around the end of the 1800s, they said there were supposedly just like millions of people that were participating in and exploring this kind of like spiritual movement.
See, that's amazing because if you go back like 100, years or whatever, or before that, or however long, you actually had people being prosecuted for being witches, for having the
Oh yeah,
exact same experiences. So by legitimizing it on stage like that, it was allowing so many people to come out and
it
really
did.
say, okay, I'm having this experience too, and I'm not going to get burned for being a witch by talking about it.
A
So it
lot of
was, yeah.
a lot of spiritualists were very like aware of that at the time, like just how different things were. And at the time period too, already like radically changing so much that it was just sort of like, of course we can talk to the dead now because everything is changing. Because like at the time there were things like the telegraph and the phone were like being like slowly developed, so it was sort of like the concept that you could like communicate with something that you couldn't see was just like such a like, oh well, of course, well, we could communicate with people who aren't here, of course we could talk to dead people. Because I think they even talked about who was it like, was it like one of the main scientists was like made like a machine to like try and talk to dead people like at the time. I don't think it was Alexander Graham Bell, but it might have been the name escapes me. But like
Yeah.
they were also discovering things like principles of like, not discovering, but they were like understanding them better, like scientific principles like electricity and magnetism and things like radiation and stuff like that. Like these things that we couldn't see. And so at the time, it was actually sort of like the world was going from like everyone being on like these little farming communities relying on candlelight to like factories and these big things. It was all kind of happening all at once. And like you said, the spiritualists were very aware of like people being persecuted, which is why a lot of them kind of looked back on those people saying that like they were experiencing these things and were totally like misunderstood. One of the big figures that a lot of the early spiritualists really kind of rallied around was actually Joan of Arc, because she was literally burned at the stake for witchcraft, but was claiming to have seen like visions of angels and things like that. And then people ended up saint. And so like they kind of like use that as like, see, like we're gonna be shown that what we're saying is the same thing while you people are like kind of persecuting us and did this to the people in the past.
Yeah, so that really represents a huge change in society's thinking as society
Yeah.
itself is progressing forward. Like I said, it's really a progressive, it's a part of the progression of society in that time. I don't think there could have been a better time for this to evolve openly.
Yeah,
The
it really
world
was
was
like,
ready. Yeah.
yeah, that was actually oh, I wish I had written this down. Um the message that kind of, so when the Fox sisters were in Rochester, um this is kind of an interesting story because people don't talk about this one. So when the Fox sisters were in Rochester, they were staying at their sister's house, and the idea was they'll go there because the spirit rappings that were in their little cabin were kept going. It was really noisy and it was attracting a lot of attention, and so they go to Rochester, and the noises followed them. And like Leah actually wrote like a whole kind of like autobiography about this experience, and she talked about how like furniture was moving and the piano was like playing by itself, things that we might associate with like poltergeist phenomenon.
Right.
but
Right.
but the whole point was that came in, which was Isaac Post, and he was like, why don't you try calling out the alphabet like you did at the house? Maybe it's that they're trying to get your attention to say something. And so Leah was kind of just like, what is it you're trying to say? And then everything stopped, and then they just heard these knocks, and the knocks gave this message that this is me paraphrasing it, but it was basically saying like, the time has come for you to make this known to the world. Things are ready, and we want to like let people know that this can happen. um
I love that.
and so from that on, that's when everything really just shifted. And then that's that after that is when they got the thing for Corinthian Hall and stuff like that. And Leah, because a lot of people are very negative about Leah Fox. I actually
So she was
have
the
a
older sister?
yes,
Okay.
she was much older than them, probably like by like 8 years or something like that. um I have kind of a soft spot for Leah Fox, and I'm a bit sympathetic to her, and I feel like she was very, very, very misunderstood and kind of like demonized, mostly by men. and and so she actually was one of the very first people to kind of write that she felt, she described her feelings for this experience in the terms of like a religious conversion. And she was really one of the first people early on to like really realize that this wasn't just like a local ghost story. There was something way deeper and way more important to all of this. And then also Amy and Isaac Post also immediately kind of picked up on that as well, coming from that kind of tradition of Quakerism, with the idea that communication with like spirit was like this important inward thing that everyone could experience. Um, and so it was just kind of here, just going, just I guess to sum it up, is just here in Rochester is really kind of like the birthplace of spiritualism and also all these other movements. One of the things we're like most famous for are like progressive movements and ghosts, basically.
I love it. I love it. With Mount Hope Cemetery, it's amazing. I
Dead
mean,
people and progressive dead people.
that come out to talk.
Yes.
I love it. I mean, yeah, I mean,
Can't shut up. Death doesn't shut them up.
no, 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 we all know that. But if anybody out there has never come up to Rochester to see some of the stuff, I mean, Mount Hope Cemetery is just a landmark of just interesting people are there, and the tours, and what it used to be used for literally was a picnic place, and people would go and just clean the graves and have picnics, and it was fun, and it's beautiful. It's on like old glacier hills, and but I digress, because Mount Hope is one of my favorite places around here.
Can I add one little thing for people who want to
Yeah,
visit? Is
yeah,
that Mount Hope Cemetery? I forgot the name of him, but it was designed by the same man that did Central Park in New York City.
yeah. So you can really
Yeah,
see how nice it
Oh.
is. Yes,
yeah,
I have a
yes.
question real quick, Stephen, and
yeah,
I want to go all the way back real quick.
yeah.
So,
I like that.
thank you. Explain to me the difference between spiritual, like being spiritual, and the actual religion of spiritualism. Like, what are some of those main differences?
So spiritual is basically just like kind of, I guess, like an adjective, like where it's like something is spiritual. So it's sort of like the spirituality of the spirituality of this. Like anyone, faith of any background can be spiritual. Like you can be Catholic and spiritual, you can be pagan and spiritual. It's just a way of describing someone that believes in like a spiritual experience, spiritual worlds, things like that.
Outside
Spiritualism,
of the norm.
yeah, and then spiritualism is a term that was just kind of coined, where it's sort of like the practice and belief of believing in like spirits as pertaining to this really specific historical movement. So like So
Okay.
like it specifically talks about like if you were a spiritualist, it means you identify with like this movement, the things that come from it and stuff like that. This is one of the big things I talk about a lot because these terms are very like not concrete at all. Because like there, so for a lot of other religions, there's been like tons and tons and tons of academic research and stuff. Spiritualism has not had a lot of academic stuff. So a lot of the terms and stuff are very they're always changed around by like, so people will write books and they'll use terms that spiritualists may not actually call themselves, or spiritualists actually sometimes call themselves different things. So to make issues so complicated is that a lot of early spiritualists called themselves just spiritual, like they would have like a spiritual church or like a spiritual philosophy. And then you also have a lot of English speaking spiritualists simply just refer to themselves as spiritualists, whereas in a lot of other countries, they use the term spiritism because they identify with a system of spiritualism that renamed itself spiritism, but is still a spiritualist tradition. So it is very confusing. But I think that the simplest kind of thing is that spiritualist movement was like a historical movement with like its own traditions, its own history, its own teachings, and that is kind of like what the main difference is. One of the ways people kind of explain it is that like sometimes it's capital S spiritualism is like the historical movement, and then little s spiritualism sometimes just means like the phenomenon of mediumship that can be for anything.
Spiritual. Okay.
Yeah,
Groovy. Thank you so much.
yeah, it's confusing.
It
It
sounds
does.
like it blurs a little bit, and I
It
can
does.
understand that because I mean, spiritual is such a broad word, right? So I can understand how that would get a little
Yeah,
convoluted.
very convoluted.
And they have tried to organize it under different organizing entities. There's different like spiritualist organizations that
Yeah,
different spiritualist churches are under. So just to add more to it, they
yeah, and then
all
they all have
have
different
different
definitions.
things. Right. And I mean there's the basic, if you want to call it, from religion beliefs, would be that we believe that people live on. We believe that we're able to communicate with them, and the door to reformation is never closed, and live by the golden rule. Although it's not always phrased exactly that way, and there's more of them than that, but it's not. It's not. It doesn't. Stephen, didn't it start kind of a more identified with Christianity and then like broke off, or was it always broken off from Christianity and then Christianity came into some of the different groups of it? Does that make sense? Or
I'm
other
smiling.
religion?
I'm smiling because this is like my favorite subject.
Oh, perfect.
um, so everything is very complicated, and
Yes.
so basically what happened is you have kind of like what I we talked about, those events, like those experiences that happened. People started talking about doing mediumship, and what happened right from the get-go was you had people interpret it in different ways, but so like they all kind of happened at the same time. And so like spiritualism doesn't really have like one founder. It's like a movement with several different kind of people in it that all kind of like collectively contributed different parts of it. So one of the big things that makes this so complicated is that at the time people were really involved in like what they called like the free thought movement, and it was the idea that we should not be constrained by dogma and church teachings and things like that. So a lot of early spiritualists were very not the idea of forming churches. The earliest spiritualists really were kind of not into that. However, there were spiritualists who genuinely did interpret spiritualism through like a Christian lens, but it was still like a very, very like progressive Christian lens. Like Christians, so there are Christian spiritualists. 99% of them do not believe the central like things in Christianity. Like they view it through like a more progressive thing. So a lot of the Christians in the 1800s that were very interested in spiritualism were very, very like liberal Christian denominations that like, so like Unitarians, Universalists, Quakers, things like that. So they didn't necessarily believe that like Jesus was God or that the Bible was like 110% true. It was more kind of like the idea that like Jesus is like a spiritual teacher. The Bible is inspired in some way that it's still like a product of humankind. So those early kind of things were very influential in spiritualism in one kind of like line of tradition. So there's always been people that have thought of it as like a Christian thing. But on the other hand, there's people who always kind of viewed spiritualism in more of a broader sense of things. Um, One of the first kind of central texts that kind of happened with spiritualism is there's this psychic at the time who actually predated the spiritualist movement by a couple years. And his name was Andrew Jackson Davis, not to be confused with President Andrew Jackson, who was a monster. But Andrew Jackson Davis was kind of like an early precursor to like Edgar Casey, where like he would go into like a sleep and he would produce these writings that were just talked about all sorts of metaphysical things. And he produced this book early on, like literally predating spiritualism by just maybe like 5 years or so. And because this book had come out so soon, a lot of spiritualists were like, "Oh, this is exactly what we're talking about." And it talked about the idea that you could communicate with spirits, and it also kind of set the way for how spiritualists saw themselves as like a philosophy, where they talked about all the things that you just mentioned, Deanna, where it was like they talked about God being kind of like infinite intelligence, the principles of nature being like we learn how to develop and understand through nature, like that the spirit world is part of the natural world and that everything is just kind of like interconnected. And he did also talk about like spiritual figures, but in a very broader sense. So he kind of would include like Jesus, Buddha, Confucius, Muhammad, like as all just kind of like being these sort of figures of a greater human spiritualism that his teachings became like the foundational principles for how American spiritualists and also mostly English speaking spiritualists kind of went from then on. As I said, things in Europe went a little bit different because they kind of went with another philosopher named Allan Kardec, and then his teachings, which were very similar to Andrew Jackson Davis but slightly different. Um, his teachings went on to become very, very popular in honestly probably most of the world. So like most spiritualists in the world are probably more in like the tradition of like what we call spiritism, which is a form of spiritualism. And then most English speaking spiritualists tend to follow kind of that more Andrew Jackson Davis style of kind of like what we've been talking about. And then within the United States, kind of jumping off what you said to make things more complicated, um, different organizations later on organize themselves, calling themselves spiritualist churches, where they kind of tried to define their approach to spiritualism. And so, as a worldwide movement, you have tons and tons of little organizations that all identify as spiritualists, but all kind of teach different things. But as I said, the nice thing about spiritualism is that a lot of these organizations don't like necessarily view each other as like, oh, well, it's not like Christian churches where it's sort of like constant infighting. It's more like they're just like, oh, well, they focus on this instead, and we kind of just do things this way. There's like kind of an understanding that all of these,
Acceptance.
yeah, an acceptance that all of these teachings are spiritualism and that they shouldn't like limit things to a box. I will add just as like a footnote that is not the case with every organization, but I would say comparatively to like other religions, it's still a bit better with acceptance of differences.
And you can be other religions at the same time. I mean,
Oh,
we don't, at least
yeah,
in some of most of them, you can come into spiritualism and still identify as any other
ab-
religion you want, hold any other belief that you want, and it can
absolutely.
incorporate in, and
Ab-
I think that's the beauty because in our church, we have people that believe in God, we have people that don't believe in God, we have people that quote the Bible, we have people that don't want to read the Bible, but we also have this overriding adhesiveness in that what we do believe, which is the basics of the spiritualism, is that basically we go on and we can talk about it later, right? We can talk about it
yeah,
after we're gone. I mean, that's one of the big things. And the nature, which I can't believe I forgot to mention it when I was talking about it, was, we live by natural law. We are part of natural law.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of it, I think, is that it's so open to allowing so many other beliefs into it that it's really tough to be excluded from it in any
Yeah.
way.
The little thing I kind of like to say is specifically referring to like our group, which I mean, it's
We'll
the
yeah,
Rochester,
we'll link to it.
yeah, the Rochester Spiritual Society. What I kind of like to tell people is that we kind of we have do's but no don'ts. Um, so by like we have a
Oh,
very short thing that's called like our Declaration of Principles, which most spiritualist churches will have, and it's a very simple list of kind of things that we stand for. Um, all there's tons of different versions of them because all spiritualist churches have like their own version of it. And to us, at least, it's sort of like if you agree with these, that makes you a spiritualist, and you can just kind of bring in whatever else you have with you. Um, because I don't know, I think it's just that we really, at least our kind of tradition that we have going on, really goes kind of hard into that free thought thing. The idea that this is sort of your experience and you should be able to discern your path for yourself here, and then these principles are just sort of like tools to help you better understand things.
Right. We're not going to define your experience with whatever else is out there. That's yours to
Yeah.
I
find,
love
yours to
that.
define, but we're going to walk on a path with you while we find our own.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
That's why I'm dedicated to it.
Yes. Yes. So when we talk about traditions and stuff, a typical spiritualist service, they identify as churches in some, I mean, we're called society, but we are a church.
Yeah, no, yeah.
And but so people go into a service, and even though there's different things, some services are Christian based and they use the Bible and they use
Yeah,
more conventional prayers. Some services are not. Like ours, we do prayers, but we don't necessarily do the ones that are kind of common knowledge prayers or whatever. And we
yeah.
certainly encourage thoughts and speech from all different faiths. No faith is unwelcome. Um, but what is like, tell us a little bit about a service. Like, what are the things that are the same in almost all spiritualist church services?
So, I actually, so what I like to do, because I think it's kind of just fun, to me, it's fun. It's a kind of, if we look at Rochester, Rochester, New York, Rochester tends to be like a kind of like spiritualism under a microscope. So it's
Mhm.
sort of like if you want to like understand how spiritualism is, you can use the churches and organizations here in Rochester as like a good jumping off point. So there's three spiritualist churches here in Rochester, New York, and I think they're very representative of the different kinds of spiritualist services and churches and organizations you can have. So the three components that you'll see in all of these different organizations is that there is a demonstration of mediumship. So where mediums will go on what like they call platform, which actually is like a term that comes from when mediums before churches where they were just on like a platform, like a stage, and they would be demonstrating mediumship. Then you have healing, which is a form of healing that is pretty specifically spiritualist, comes from the 1800s. It's just kind of a kind of energy healing. There are different kinds of healing that people can use. We obviously have people that are trained in more other traditions like Reiki, and I know you know way more about healing stuff than I do.
Yes.
But the traditional basic spiritualist healing is kind of just like this energy healing that I feel a lot of people who even go to Christian churches would kind of recognize because it's very much like it's similar to like laying on the hands of like some like holiness and Pentecostal churches where they do that and they just put your hands on them and pray over you.
But
And
wait,
that
we are not tapping anyone on the forehead and having them fall down.
no.
Right. It's literally, we're
Yeah,
just head and shoulder. Well, our tradition, sit in a chair, head and shoulders.
yeah.
It's not it's not like what you think of as the faith healers on TV. I just want to make sure that that point is clear for
It's
anyone who's learning about this.
it is much quieter than those
Yes.
traditions. So if
Yes.
you turned the volume down a lot, that would be more similar to what we're doing.
And
And
nobody's
then
fallen over on my watch, so.
yeah, I will say though that actually there are spiritualist churches where that happens.
Oh yeah.
Again, it just goes into like different traditions of things. Um and then the last component is a just a lecture. we tend to not call them sermons. I think that also goes back to the like kind of the free thought time period where it was more, they would call it like an uplifting lecture or something like that rather than like a sermon, because they really wanted to get away from the idea that you're being preached at. Um, so those three components are really like the main keys that if you go to any spiritualist service, you will experience those. Where it kind of differences, the differences though are really more like the aesthetics of things and just how people do stuff. Um, so like here in Rochester, we have there is a church that is, should I give names? I don't really care. Like like if people want to look it up, I don't, because there's different churches.
I mean, it's important to talk about the
Yeah,
history, so
yeah.
yeah.
So there's one church, which is Plymouth Spiritualist Church, which is the oldest congregation here in Rochester. Um, good dating back to like 1906, and they're associated with the organization called the National Spiritualist Association of Churches. They, how I kind of describe them is that they kind of fall a little bit on religious spiritualism, kind of tilted towards the philosophical aspect, where they don't have as like kind of the like they said, like you mentioned, like they wouldn't say like anything really from the Bible or like the Our Father or anything like that. It's a bit more plain in a nice way. Like if you went to kind of like some of the Protestant churches where it's just there's no candles or things like that. It's just a very simple kind of thing. They'll have flowers in their service and stuff, and they'll just have very simple things. It's more on the philosophical side of things.
And we can
Um,
say is that the philosophy of more closer to the philosophy of their overarching group. I mean,
yeah,
it's not anything bad. It's just a
no,
different way to
yeah.
explain how
It's
they're
it's
doing
it's
things.
it's less bells and whistles, and that's just kind
Good
of
way
how
to
they
put
do
it.
stuff.
Mhm.
They focus so that the NSAC in general just focuses more on kind of like the mental mediumship, uh philosophical things and stuff like that. So if you go in there, there'll be hymns, but it's just more, it's much more simple in like in their tradition.
Mhm.
On kind of the other side of the spectrum is the Church of Divine Inspiration, which is very much a Christian spiritualist church. So if you go in there, there are candles, there are vestments, they will read the Bible, there are very Christian hymns, there are statues of like the Sacred Heart of Jesus and the Virgin Mary. On the other side of that though, they do also have, there'll be like a little statue of Buddha, there'll be I don't know.
Mm.
And they have, and then they will use traditional prayers. They'll say like Our Father, things like that. So the aesthetics of them are more kind of on the religious side, where it's like lots of outward kind of rituals and things like that. Although the teachings that they have are basically just the same as what we do, where it's like the principles of spiritualism, stuff like that. So it's the traditions of how they represent themselves are really more of like an outward thing of what you feel more comfortable with. And then I always kind of say that our group, the Rochester Spiritualist Society, is much kind of way more in like in the middle, where I think the service is a little bit kind of like where we keep it very simple and very like to the point. Like we have the prayers and principles and stuff slightly similar to what you may see in like Lilydale or even like NSAC churches, but we also allow this kind of flexibility where we have like more religious things are actually like welcomed, especially like from guest speakers, to bring in traditions that they want to share with people. So like for instance, for me, in my own personal things, I kind of do side a little bit more to like the religious spiritualism. Like I often will like quote the Bible or like the Psalms when I'm giving a talk. At the end of my services, when I'm facilitating, I always include like a prayer of Saint Francis of Assisi. The one that everyone knows, it's like for peace, like Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. And just because that's sort of like the tradition that I am part of in my own personal life. And and the thing is, we this flexibility is, I feel like, is really appreciated in our group, where people like to experience these different things and different traditions. And so it's kind of like I said, it's more of like a middle way between the like kind of these other spiritualist churches. Also, if you ever go to, if anyone who's listening ever goes to Lilydale, they also, which is a spiritualist camp here in Western New York, they also have several spiritualist churches there, and they all kind of do the same thing, where there's like the one that's more plain in a nice I don't want to say plain sounds so bad, but it's just in more they're more
Maybe more
yeah
simple.
yeah
More,
more
yeah,
yeah
yeah.
more
Yeah.
simple um
Yeah.
where it's more simple. But then there's also the churches that are super elaborate that'll have like crystals and candles and colors and all these like bright things and stuff like that. And as you mentioned, we actually have members who are members of these other spiritualist churches that are also members of our group, like in Lilydale and things like that, where a lot not all spiritualist churches do this, but many spiritualist churches allow you to be members of different things. We even have a few members that are members of at least one member that's a member of a synagogue. We have a couple of members that are a member of like New Thought churches. So everyone in our group brings kind of their own thing with them to share with each other, and we all learn from those different experiences. But in the end, all of these different spiritualist churches still have like a little handful of kind of core principles and practices that kind of like unite us, and make us all part of this like shared tradition.
I'm so glad you brought that up. That's actually one of the things. Number one, I love how open this is, and hey, let's blend together. Let's be accepting. I mean, come on, that's just a beautiful thing. However, I'm so glad you brought that up because that's where I was going. So what is some of those core values or the core beliefs, or I don't know, what do you call them? But some of those core principles that a spiritualist or a spiritualist church would have. I'm sure there's
Like,
just probably a
yeah,
few handful.
I'm actually grabbing. I actually have it written down right now just because there's a lot.
Oh,
So most churches will have like a declaration of principles, and there's about eight or nine different
Yeah.
principles, and it's sort of like this goes back to like the like early like 1900s, where it was just spiritualists wanted to sort of like they didn't want to be like you have to believe these things. It was more of a summary of what we agree on. And
mm,
so for us it's for ours I can actually just read them because it's
Yeah.
pretty so ours is actually based on because as I said there's several different ones. There's the one so the NSAC one is sort of like the blueprint for a lot of the ones in the United States. Um, and then at different times, different churches have broken off and edited their own. So how it usually goes for the most in the United States is that there's like about nine or eight of them, whereas in England and Canada they have about seven. And it's all basically the same things. But what we did when we were founding our group was we kind of compiled all of these together, and then we're just like we're gonna like reword them in a way that makes sense to us. And so we actually based ours off of the Canadian version with influences from the other ones as well. So we have eight principles in the Rochester Spiritual Society, and it's just infinite spirit. So the idea of like, infinite intelligence, God, and then we say that like there's like some say higher power, God, infinite intelligence, great spirit, just kind of like a God of your own understanding.
Universe,
Um,
source,
yeah,
whatever. Yeah.
yeah. Um, the second is the unity and equality of all, which it's kind
mm,
of nice because this is also kind of like there's like a metaphysical connection of that of how everyone is being connected, and then there's also like a social level of that where we're all like connected to each other socially, politically, religiously, but then also metaphysically that we're all interconnected with each other. My personal favorite is the Ministry of Spirits and Angels, and it's just the
mm.
idea that elevated spirits minister to us and through the gifts of mediumship and healing, and that everyone can experience this and has some kind of like inner spiritual gift to share. Um, the other is continuous existence of the soul, which, as I said, is like probably like the bare minimum of like
Mhm.
spiritualism, that you believe that like the spirit, the personal identity, can exist after death. Um, there is personal responsibility, the idea that we are actually responsible for our actions. There is no like in Christian theology where it's just sort of like vicarious atonement, where it's just sort of like I am this like miserable sinner that can do nothing. In spiritualism it's very much like no, you are the one that is in charge of your actions, your life, and you can change your life to be better.
Mm.
We also
I
have,
heard
yeah,
accountability.
Mhm.
yes. Another one which I think you might like is, because you kind of mentioned it and I was like, it popped in my head, was personal truth. And it's the idea that we're all called to kind of uh, find our own way to like capital T truth, that there are truths that are out there that are principles of nature, and that our journey to find them is our own journey. And that kind of goes in with the other one as well, where it's like, yeah. And then which the next part is going living in harmony with natural law. The idea that there are I mean I historically understand where it comes from, but I hate law, like, because it's more
Yeah.
of it's more of the that there are forces in nature that are things like balance, creativity, attraction, and that by kind of tuning yourself in with the infinite will help you really just like flourish as a being. Um, and then the last one is the eternal progress for every soul. And that's kind of what like Deanna quoted earlier, where there's a couple different phrases of how spiritualists use it, but it's sort of like that the idea that the door to reformation is never closed, the door to hope is never closed. And it's the idea that like we can become better. We can become better, not just like, and I don't just mean like in terms of good or bad. We can just improve and progress and heal, and we always have that option, like always, like it's always there
Oh,
and into the next life, so that if you do make mistakes in this life, you can still heal onward, whether it's in another life that you're reborn, or in like, you know, on the other side of spirit, that we can that healing just continues forever.
what a concept that you can be the best version of yourself that you choose to be every day. Yeah,
Yeah.
what a concept.
And it
I was
really,
spiritualist and I didn't even know it.
Yeah.
that's what happened to me. That's how I
I
found
Yeah.
it.
I
Mhm.
had no idea I was a spiritualist because I'm like totally resonating and a little bit of identifying with all of those. And I'm like, oh, I think I'm a spiritualist.
But you
yeah
see, that's how it fits in with
That's so
everything.
great.
Yeah.
and how we kind of that's basically our thing, is like, if you agree with that, then you too are a spiritualist. Because that's pretty much like the bare minimum for us, where it's sort of like anything you want to bring in that is your on your path or your journey, as long as it's like, as long as it's, you know, with that, you're good.
Right.
That is
Right.
so cool.
And I mean, we welcome all walks because everybody's got something to say and everybody's got something to learn. And
And
when we
share.
combine that together and we share that in our talks, which we call them talk, I mean, I know lecture. I didn't want anyone to think that like you have to sit there and
Yeah.
take notes lecture. It's literally
Yeah,
our church, at least 15 minutes of somebody talking about something that they want to share.
it's
Easy
basically a TED
peasy.
talk.
Most of them. Yeah, yeah, it is actually. Um, but the whole religion, philosophy, science in and of itself, there have been there have been so many changes in it, but yet so much at the core is still the same. And that's the beauty, that it can grow and it can morph into more, but it always holds on to those central values. And I
Yeah.
think it's important to point out here, because at the risk of other people going like, well, don't you believe in God? What about Jesus? They're all good. They're all there if you want
Yeah.
them there. You know, there are people that do believe, there are people that don't believe. Either path is okay, because it's not up to any one person to tell somebody else what they can and can't or should and shouldn't believe. And I think that that is really a core part of spiritualism, is that you really can make your own path and still have the beliefs that you know are true for you, that you hold sacred for yourself.
Yeah, and kind of going off of what I said about the spiritualist churches not really like necessarily like excluding each other. It's sort of just like, if you want if you want more Jesus in your service, you can go to the Christian spiritualist church down the street. They do that, and it's like, if you want more eclectic stuff, you can come to this one, and it's just sort of like, and I feel like, at least for our group, because one of the other big things with spiritualism is that it's not limited to the churches. Like, you have to be your own person on your own. So you can have Jesus, you can have Buddha, you can do transcendental meditation, you can just do that on your own. And when you come into the spiritualist churches, most of them, you can share that with other people, your experiences, and just talk about them. Um, and just sharing an experience with someone else doesn't mean that everyone has to automatically believe it or accept it, but I feel like these communities will support you no matter what. Like if you're sharing your
Mhm.
experience about how you experience something, you will get support no matter what it is.
Mhm.
I almost kind of see that as like an AA type meeting, like, hey, just listen to this person.
That's
Just because you don't agree with it doesn't make it right or wrong because that's their experience and how they got here.
I have a fun, quick little thing about that is that AA and the foundation and principles of AA were
So
actually
spiritual.
started by spiritualists.
Shut the front door,
Ah, I love
really?
that.
And so I forgot the name of the book. I forgot the name of the book. It's not like the big book, like the or the blue book. What is it called? Blue
Friends of
book.
John or Friends of, I'm sorry, I don't want to
Yeah,
sound ignorant. I can't remember.
it's not like that one, but it's published by AA, and it's like there's a biography about one of the founders, and I think it's
Yeah,
Bill.
by Bill.
Yeah,
Bill, that's it.
and
Bill
he
W.
attended a séance or several séances, and part of his ideas of the 12 steps were actually like channeled through mediums of like
Shh.
a
Don't
yeah
tell
like
people that because they'll stop going to AA.
I
Yeah.
mean it's in it's well they
We
talk
don't
well
have
Like
we have
we
cookies, but
well
Yeah,
I'll
because
say
it's
this.
such a good place for so many. I mean, I love AA. Um, I think they have a lot
They've
to
changed since
offer.
then though. So I mean like the initial foundation came from that, the ideas
That's
came from
so
that,
cool.
but it was obviously more elaborated on over time. And then even with AA, they kind of have the same flexibility, like you said, where it's sort of
Yes.
like higher power and things like that. But and I could talk about that forever, but there's a very, very long history of spiritualism and spiritualists being involved in care and concern for people who are suffering from alcoholism and addiction. Like that's there's a strain of kind of spiritualist tradition where the idea of like psychological healing and stuff like that when no one else would do it was is there, that they very much have that as historically part of spiritualism.
well, that's the societal outreach that has been going on
Yeah,
since day one. When you talk about the Amy and Isaac Irving and everything that they were doing, and then how it blossomed from there, is that as a spiritualist, you really do feel a sense of uh community and a sense of I'm part of this, you're part of this, let's work together. What can we do to help? I mean that
yeah,
it's and a lot of religions do that. It's not just
yeah.
this one.
So I think the best thing about what you just said is that if you remember, like those early spiritualists were all from different religions, and like there was no spiritualism as like a thing like when it started, and so you had all of these people who brought basically the best parts of their religions together to kind of like come together and just help people, because like you had like the Quakers, who are like probably the closest you could get to like actually doing what Jesus did, where it's
Hmm.
just like helping everyone unconditionally. But then like Leah Fox came from like a Methodist tradition that also kind of had outreach and stuff like that. And then you had other traditions as well. You had people from Native American traditions, New Thought traditions, and they all just kind of brought these parts of their religion of helping people and doing good and things like that to come together as spiritualists to help people, which is why I think you have like this spiritualism as a tradition that's so focused on healing and helping and doing all of this, because all of the people who were healers and helpers were the ones that started it when they came together.
Hmm.
I love this.
It's
Wow.
just a wonderful tradition. I mean, if I want to speak about my own personal experience, it was just like you, Ronnie. I didn't know that's what I was, but I knew that I wasn't quite feeling at home at the various different churches I would go to
Mm.
find a place where I could find a spiritual base, right? When I was really getting going in my metaphysical work and all that, I felt like I needed a spiritual base. And I went to different churches, didn't quite find it, even was out at the Unitarian church and for a minute thought that was it, but I was like, nope, there's something missing. And when I started going to one of the other churches here in Rochester, and I was like, that's the part that was missing. That whole healing and that whole bit. And so moving into spiritualism doesn't negate any of my other beliefs. It just
Yeah,
brings me more of a foundation and a base and a home.
100%.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So I would like to say that Stephen, you are a absolute wealth of knowledge, and we would love to have you come back again, and we could talk a whole nother bit about all of this. Would
I
I would
you?
feel
love
like
that.
we could dig really deep into a lot
Yeah,
of things.
I would
Yeah.
love
yeah.
that.
Because
Great.
I
We
happen
will.
to love history, and it sounds like you have all this knowledge, so I could just really pick your brain.
I mean one thing I'll just quickly mention is that
Yeah.
I one of the big things to me that I kind of focus on is the history of spiritualism is particularly here in Rochester, New York, but just in general, is so underdocumented because uh the early days of spiritualism is very well documented. So like the Fox sisters, things like that. And there were a couple books that were published up until about like the 1920s, but the problem is spiritualists stopped writing about their history. And so a lot of academic history books pretty much end at spiritualism in the 1920s because that was the last time anyone wrote a book about it. And there's more people are looking into it now, there's bits and pieces, but it's so hard to study as a tradition because spiritualists either self-published, didn't publish, oral traditions, things like that. So what I've actually been doing, one of my big projects here in Rochester is documenting the history of like those other years from like past from the 1920s to now, because there's so many important people, women and men, that helped so many people like with all of these different things, but no one ever really talks about them. And so one of my projects has just been documenting all of that. And I technically am in charge of the history committee for the Rochester Spiritual Society, so that's been fun.
Good for you. That's so
Yes.
exciting.
Yes, it's just wonderful what you're doing out there to preserve this and to move it
I
forward
agree.
as society goes into its next steps of wherever it's going, to still have the base of where at least this movement has come from, and to give us a good trackable history of how we've grown and what we've become.
I also put up all my research for free on the internet, so that is
Yes.
Actually, that's one
So
of the things we're going to ask for is, so can we post a link to you?
oh yeah,
Or do
absolutely.
you have a website or Facebook?
Yeah, yeah. So I have everything. So
Okay.
so
Okay.
if you go to StephenPatrickSpiritualist.com, and that's Stephen with a PH, um it has my links to literally everything on there. Like all of my blogs, my Facebook, my Instagram. They're all just right on that page.
StephenPatrickSpiritualist.com.
Yep.
Gotcha.
absolutely. And if we want to find the Rochester Spiritualist Society,
Yes, it is. Do you want me to say it or do you
I
want to
do
do
want
it?
you to say it. Yes.
It's rochesterspiritualsociety.org. And then it's kind of the same thing where we have all of our links on there. So we have a Facebook page, which is probably the most regularly updated if you want to go to any of like the events and stuff. Then we also have, more recently, we actually have an Instagram. Again, those are all on there. And all of the Sunday talks are posted on YouTube, which is also linked on there as well.
Yes,
Cool.
and so people can come and get an idea of what the diversity is in the things that we talk about, and also get a chance to see all of us and more people you've probably seen on this podcast or that you are yet to meet on this podcast.
That you will meet.
You will meet, yes.
Mm. Oh,
Also
yeah.
on there. So a little blurb for what we're doing. I think we're in our fifth year. Is this
Next month.
next month is our 5 year anniversary. So, we are
Congrats.
we
Good
are
for
an
you
es-
guys.
we are an established spiritualist church here in Rochester, New York, and obviously go to any of them, see what sits right with you, do whatever you want to do. Stephen, when you come back, I'd love us to talk maybe a little more about Lilydale and just some more cool stuff. So,
Absolutely.
we'll have to plan something. So I think we're about ready.
Yeah.
We're just about reaching the end of our time for today's episode. So, Stephen, as always, thank you, my dear friend, for coming.
Dude, thank you. This
And
has been so enlightening. Thank you. Like
yes.
I said, I
No
didn't even know
problem.
I was a spiritualist.
now
I
you
knew
now
I
you
was
are.
spiritual, and now I know I'm a spiritualist as well. So thank you
Yes.
for telling me more about myself,
Yes.
which we don't have other people doing too often. So great, and thank you.
And for
Um,
anybody out there in YouTube land, as always, if you have questions, reach out on the links, post them on here. We definitely look, we definitely answer. And I think if you guys are ready, we're ready to call a wrap. Is that good?
all righty. Thank you,
Bye,
everyone, for being here
everybody.
again. Stephen, thanks so
Thank
much,
you.
and
All
have a
No
great rest
problem.
of everyone's
Thank
day.
you. You too.
right.
Bye.